Take a good look at this chart. It's the result of a drastic shift, a consequence no one had seen coming. You see, around 2015, the UK's economy was growing steadily at around 2.2%. But as you can see clearly in the chart, by 2019, something had shifted. Growth wasn't just slowing, it had turned negative in the aftermath of the greatest social-economic change Britain had ever seen, Brexit. And that's not all. Things were so bad after the UK left the EU that it seemed like the country would never return to its glory days. What happened between when the UK was a member to now, and how could so much devastation come from a plan meant to bring prosperity to Great Britain? Let's break it down. In the years leading up to 2016, a storm was brewing in the United Kingdom, one that would ultimately lead to one of the most defining moments in its modern history. It all started with the idea of complete freedom. For decades, many in the UK felt they were losing control because decisions that affected laws, regulations, and policies were increasingly being made in Brussels, not London. The feeling of power slipping away wasn't just anecdotal. By 2015, a British social attitudes survey found that 65% of people wanted the EU to have less power. But freedom wasn't the only concern. Immigration became the lightning rod for public outrage. Back in 2004, when the EU expanded to include countries like Poland, Hungary, and others in Western Europe, the UK braced itself for an increase in migration. The government had estimated that only 13,000 people would arrive each year, but the reality was much different. Now picture this. By the end of the first year, 87,000 people had moved to the UK, and by 2007, 750,000 people from these new member states had made Britain their home. How could this not cause outrage? Public services felt the strain, neighbourhoods changed rapidly, and many people worried about their jobs. Then came the money. The UK was one of the EU's biggest contributors, and people started asking tough questions. Where was all this money going? In the fiscal year 2015 to 2016, the UK's gross contribution to the EU was £19.6 billion. Even after the rebate, a deal famously negotiated by Margaret Thatcher decades earlier, the net contribution was still £14.7 billion. That's £14.7 billion leaving the UK in just 1 year. Amid this wave of frustration, one man and his party seized the moment: Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party, or UKIP. Now, UKIP wasn't always such a big deal. When it was founded in 1993, it barely made a dent in the political landscape. By the 1997 general election, it managed only about 1% of the vote. But Farage had a vision, and he knew how to tap into the public's growing resentment. By 2014, UKIP had become a phenomenon. In that year's European Parliament elections, UKIP shocked the nation by winning 27.5% of the vote. For the first time since 1906, a party other than Labour or the Conservatives won the most votes in a nationwide election. UKIP didn't just win, they secured 24 members of the European Parliament. As UKIP's influence grew, so did public scepticism of the EU. Surveys captured this shift. In 2016, Pew Research found that only 44% of Britons viewed the EU favourably. That's less than half the population. Eventually, the frustration of the Britons was going to boil over, but nobody expected how bad things were really going to get. On June the 23rd, 2016, the United Kingdom faced a decision that would reshape its history, its politics, and its place in the world. The Leave campaign, led by figures like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, crafted messages that hit straight to the heart of public discontent. Their slogan, "Take Back Control," was everywhere, on posters, in speeches, and even plastered across a campaign bus. They pledged to restore sovereignty, reduce immigration, and redirect money, specifically the £350 million sent to the EU every week to the National Health Service. On the other side, the Remain camp, led by then Prime Minister David Cameron, warned of economic chaos and political isolation if the UK walked away from the EU. The stakes could not have been higher. When the votes were finally counted, the result was closer than anyone could have imagined. As you can see in this chart, Leave won with 51.9% of the vote, while Remain trailed at 48.1%. That's a difference of just 1.3 million votes out of the 33.57 million cast. The voter turnout was astonishing, 72.2%, the highest in a nationwide election since 1992. In raw numbers, 17.4 million people voted to leave, while 16.1 million wanted to stay. As the results sank in, the political fallout became almost immediate. Prime Minister David Cameron, who had staked his career on the Remain campaign, announced his resignation the very next day. He admitted that the UK needed new leadership to navigate the uncharted waters of Brexit. Theresa May stepped in as the new Prime Minister, inheriting the task of negotiating the UK's exit from the EU. The road beyond this point was long and complicated and divided the entire nation of the UK in ways nobody had seen before. To promote Brexit, the Leave campaign shared an idea of a brighter future where the UK could make its own trade deals designed to fit its needs. Free from EU rules and limits, they promised that Britain could open doors to valuable markets around the world. People from the Leave campaign said the EU, as a group, often slowed down trade talks or focused more on the needs of other member countries instead of Britain. But it wasn't just about money. It was also about the National Health Service. A few claims from the Leave campaign grabbed attention, like the one written on their famous bus. "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead." It was a bold message that hit home for many voters. However, the claim wasn't completely accurate. The £350 million figure was a total amount paid weekly to the EU, but it didn't include the rebate or money that came back to the UK through EU programmes. In truth, the real amount sent to the EU was closer to £250 million a week. Even so, the idea of putting some of that money into healthcare convinced many voters. The NHS, already struggling with more demand and budget cuts, became a powerful symbol in the Brexit debate. Then there was immigration, the most debated issue of all. The Leave campaign openly said that being in the EU had taken away Britain's control over its borders. Under the EU's rule of free movement, any citizen from a member country could live and work in the UK without limits. For years, this caused concerns about pressure on public services and infrastructure. In 2015, net migration to the UK was 333,000 people. Of this, 184,000 were EU citizens. The Leave campaign argued that these high numbers were putting a strain on housing, schools, and healthcare, making it harder for everyday Britons to get the services they needed. The campaign said that this was a chance to give power back to the UK Parliament so decisions about immigration and border control could be made by elected leaders, not EU officials. But did these big promises come true? You're about to find out. Within weeks of David Cameron stepping down, Theresa May took over as Prime Minister on July 13, 2016, becoming the UK's second female leader. Even though May had supported staying in the EU, she promised to respect the referendum results with a well-known phrase, "Brexit means Brexit." The first big step happened on March 29, 2017. On that day, the UK officially started the process of leaving the EU by triggering Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union. This set a 2-year countdown to Brexit. Sir Tim Barrow, the UK's ambassador to the EU, personally delivered the notice to European Council President Donald Tusk, who later said, "We already miss you, thank you and goodbye." The clock was ticking, and Brexit was set for March 29, 2019. But what seemed like a simple deadline hid the growing challenges underneath. By June 19, 2017, formal talks between the UK and the EU began. The discussions focused on 3 key issues: the rights of EU and UK citizens after Brexit, the financial settlement, and the Irish border. The Irish border quickly became the most difficult issue. No one wanted a strict border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, as this could risk the fragile peace established by the Good Friday Agreement, a deal signed in 1998 that ended years of conflict. Months of tough discussions led to what seemed like progress. In November 2018, the UK and the EU revealed a draft withdrawal agreement, a detailed document outlining the terms of Brexit. It included a £39 billion financial settlement, a transition period lasting until December 2020, and the controversial Irish backstop. This backstop was designed to avoid a strict border in Ireland by keeping the UK in a customs union with the EU until a long-term trade deal could be agreed on. But the backstop became a major issue. Critics said it would leave the EU stuck without full control of its decisions. When the deal was voted on in Parliament on the 15th of January 2019, it suffered a historic defeat. It was rejected by 432 votes to 202, the largest loss for a sitting government in British history. The struggles didn't stop here. Further attempts to pass the deal also failed, throwing the government into chaos. Theresa May had to ask the EU for more time, leading to the Brexit deadline being delayed 3 times. First to the 12th of April 2019, then to the 31st of October 2019, and finally to the 31st of January 2020. It seemed that May was at a dead end, and there was only one thing left for her to do. On May the 24th, 2019, she announced her resignation with tears in her eyes, admitting that she could no longer bring her party or the country together. Her departure cleared the way for Boris Johnson, the key supporter of the Leave campaign, to take over. On July the 24th, 2019, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. He inherited a divided country and an incomplete Brexit process. Johnson acted quickly. He reopened talks with the EU, determined to replace the Irish backstop with a different solution. His efforts paid off on October the 17th, 2019, when he secured a revised withdrawal agreement. The backstop was replaced with the Northern Ireland Protocol. This new plan created a customs border in the Irish Sea, allowing Northern Ireland to follow certain EU rules while staying part of the UK's customs system. After Parliament finally approved Johnson's deal, the UK officially left the EU on January 31st, 2020, 1,317 days after the referendum. But the process wasn't over. The UK entered an 11-month transition period, staying in the EU's single market and customs union while negotiators worked on the details for their future trade relationship. As the 31st of December 2020 deadline approached, the pressure increased. Both sides worked hard to make a deal, but progress was very slow. Finally, on the 24th of December 2020, just days before the deadline, the UK and the EU announced that they had reached the trade and cooperation agreement. This deal, covering trade, security and rules, marked the end of the Brexit process and the start of a new relationship between the UK and the EU. But did it truly change things for good? What happened after Brexit was a mix of economic problems, political confusion, changing public opinion and trade difficulties that few people expected. Let's talk about the economy first. By 2023, the UK's economy was just 5.5% smaller than it would have been if the country had stayed in the EU. According to the Centre for European Reform, this meant losing tens of billions in potential income. Taxes were also affected, with a loss of £40 billion in revenue. This was money that could have been spent on healthcare, schools, or roads, but was now part of Brexit's costs. Trade was just as bad. Leaving the EU meant losing easy trade between countries. New rules, customs checks, and other measures created a lot of paperwork and extra steps for businesses. Imagine this. In January 2021, the first month after the transition period ended, UK exports of goods to the EU dropped by 40%. Even though there was some recovery later, the damage was already done. But the most surprising changes weren't just about money, they were about feelings. Many people's views about Brexit started to change in ways that its supporters hadn't expected. Polls kept showing that a lot of Britons were beginning to regret leaving the EU. Here's something surprising. A YouGov survey showed that if a vote were held today, 55% of people would choose to stay in the EU. That's a big change from the 2016 result. Another survey by JLL Partners showed how people felt. 59% of those asked said Brexit had hurt the UK's economy. Even more surprising, this included 34% of people who had voted to leave. The political effects were also serious. The Conservative Party, which had supported Brexit under leaders like Boris Johnson, started losing support as more people became unhappy. By 2023, an Ipsos poll for the Financial Times showed that the party had lost up to a third of its voters in just a few months. The results were quick and harsh. In local elections, the Conservatives lost badly, and Labour made what they called huge gains. Even areas that had been strongly Conservative for years switched to Labour, showing voters wanted change. Then there were the trade and rural-related problems, which even strong Brexit supporters couldn't ignore. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, meant to make the transition smoother, brought its own problems. While it avoided taxes and limits on trade, it added new issues like rules about product origins, customs checks, and other requirements. For businesses that had traded easily with the EU before, this was a big problem. Costs went up and companies had to deal with complicated rules that didn't exist before. Industries like chemicals and medicines were hit especially hard. Different rules between the UK and the EU meant businesses had to follow two sets of standards, which made things more expensive and less efficient. Working out agreements to make things easier in these areas became very important but moved slowly. Without these agreements, trade and investment stayed difficult, creating big challenges for industries that had once done well in the EU's single market. The Leave campaign had big hopes for the UK's future, but the journey has been tougher than expected. The difference between what was promised and what has happened shows how hard it can be to turn big ideas into reality. Now, as the UK moves forward, there's a chance to tackle these challenges and work toward the goals that inspired Brexit. The future is still open, and with effort and flexibility, the UK can build itself back once again, possibly coming out stronger than ever.